Champion evaluator paradox involves both acting as a critical evaluator for ideas within the team and an enthusiastic advocate when selling ideas to upper management and external stakeholders and other leadership types. So leaders have to balance the conviction to push an idea forward and sell it with the composure to test it first. Only what endures that disciplined scrutiny is actually worth selling. And both skills often live in conflict with one another, like all these other paradoxes. And it's a psychological tension between optimism and skepticism. Idea champions are driven by belief. They see what could be. And evaluators are driven by caution. So they protect what already works. So you have creatives and managers dynamic again. Same dilemma. When the idea champion dominates the conversation, then bad ideas end up going unchecked. But when the idea evaluator or the manager dominates the conversation, then good ideas never end up leaving the ground because they scrutinize them to death and they just never lift off. In complex organizations that solve novel and ill-defined problems or pursue some sort of innovation, then the teams tend to fail less often because of bad ideas and more often because of premature evaluation. So the managers or leaders are the ones that end up killing potential before it has time to mature and evolve. The most effective, best leaders, both by what the research suggests and from my own experience, are the ones who are able to protect the new ideas long enough to survive early criticism, but not so long that they escape accountability and escape the needed scrutiny to actually make them feasible. The insight here is that effective leaders have to learn to switch between both modes, or they at least are able to tap into people on their team that allows their team to switch between both modes. So they champion to create movement, and then they evaluate to ensure stability. And they also know when an idea needs incubation and needs more development, and then they also know when that idea is ready and needs to be inspected. When I was leading my platoon in the SEAL teams, we were slated for a deployment, but had no operational tasking, which left us in a sort of limbo state. And when you have a highly competent, highly trained team that's hungry for meaningful work, but no clear mission, it's a terrible place to be as a leader in the military. It gave me a team that was hungry, but had nothing to chew on. Rather than wait for someone to give me guidance, which may not have ever came, my leadership team and I decided to take a little bit of initiative, analyze the environment for any opportunities, and we ended up finding a creative loophole. The idea was to leverage funding from another organization to deploy domestically. Now, the idea in its early phases sold immediately because it came with money, meaning my leadership didn't have to spend any of their money on my idea. And in a resource constrained environment, which typically is the case in the military, or at least that's what everyone tells you, that's a huge opportunity. Now, what the leadership didn't know is what I intended to do with those funds. I didn't do anything illegal or immoral, but historically, West Coast SEAL teams didn't train for winter warfare or Arctic warfare. And I plan to change that. So we designed in isolation a winter warfare, Arctic warfare program that would build a new skill set for my platoon and also an identity for them. Now, early on, I kept this concept really compartmentalized, not to deceive my leadership, but to protect the idea in order that I could develop it and refine it further before I sold it. Now, the military approval process, which I was fortunate enough to be really familiar with, doesn't reward fragile ideas, which it would have been really early on. And it doesn't reward ideas that aren't grounded in a high degree of research, particularly if they don't have a precedent. And so if I shared my idea too soon, or at least if I shared too many details about my idea too soon, it would end up dying in layers of bureaucracy and risk intolerance and scrutiny. I was fortunate enough to have enough wisdom to incubate it long enough, and I timed the communication of my plan in such a way that it became easier to refine rather than reject. So once it was defensible, I brought it to the evaluators and I brought it to the specialists and I brought it to the stakeholders so that they could help me sharpen it and actually make it executable. But I did so at a point where it was easier to do that than easier to turn it off because of the commitments that we made. And that approach, where I was able to protect the idea and then expose it at the right time, is one practical expression of this paradox that I was able to employ. So here's how to operationalize this paradox. When developing a new initiative, create two phases. The first is incubation, and the second is evaluation. In the incubation phase, isolate a small, trusted group to stress test the idea privately. In my case, It was myself and my own leadership team. And then in the evaluation phase, you have to deliberately widen the circle to bring in all the dissenting voices and all the wisdom that might actually make it better. Now, part of this is choosing a criteria for how to transition and when to transition between the two. A good rule of thumb is about 70 to 80%. Once your solution or your idea has a 70 to 80% degree of being defined and the resource estimates are validated, this creates a really reliable, defined process of accountability and scrutiny without stifling the innovation. So, the key takeaway here for this paradox is that innovative leadership and leadership that is working on novel, ill defined problems require a certain rhythm. There's an advocacy and analysis that happen in alternating cycles. You promote ideas to build momentum, and then you evaluate them to ensure that there's a necessary degree of precision. The art and the heart of this paradox is knowing which hat to wear and when.